Is behavioral economics the economic mythology that is the foundation of technofeudalism? And I realize that sentence has a bunch of words that I need to define, which I will do shortly. But I will say I am a behavioral economist. This is my favorite course to teach. I love how creative it is, and I love exploring these ideas with students. And yet when I hear the critiques of behavioral economics, they're actually pretty serious, and oftentimes I'm like, yeah. Behavioral economics is the subfield of economics that involves nudging people's behavior, and many people would call that actually manipulation. In some ways, behavioral economics is a conceptual foundation that's useful for people who engage in advertising and propaganda efforts. So I do need to take seriously the question, am I contributing to the movement of our system into a surveillance economy or just an economic system that's bifurcated between those who do the manipulating and those who are manipulated? Am I contributing to that by teaching this course? So let me define these terms. And technofeudalism is an economic system laid out by this author where there's this bifurcation of power in society between the lords, the overlords who own the digital technologies, who own cloud capital, who own the servers, and they essentially sort of dictate to everybody else the rules of the economic system, the rules of the social environment, all of this stuff. The job of everybody else in a techno-feudalist system is to submit to the power of the technology overlords. That's sort of the basic idea. What is behavioral economics? And it's this subfield that takes the insights from psychology and builds them into the economic models. So you have this massive literature from the field of psychology about different quirks in the way humans work. And with economics, with the economic modeling, you have ways of weaving together an understanding of strategic behavior and human relationships and sort of interactions as they're woven across different players in a model. And marrying those two is an incredibly powerful tool set that's often used by advertisers and propagandists. In behavioral economics, we think a lot about choice architecture, which is the design of the environment within which people make their decisions. And classic example here is the cafeteria example, where a choice architect of a cafeteria might want to put the healthier food before the unhealthy food to sort of nudge people toward eating in a healthier way. That's a classic example of choice architecture. But of course, if you look at our digital environments, they're structuring our lives. They're governing our lives in a way that is really profound and has massive consequences for the population's behavior. And then back to our question, is behavioral economics the economic mythology of technofeudalism? So we need to ask, what is economic mythology? It's a set of concepts and stories and examples and anecdotes and ideas that structure people's understanding of the economic system they live within, their understanding of how it works, what's legitimate and illegitimate, what's moral and immoral. And examples of moments in the economic mythology include things like gains from trade and our narrative around what happened with stagflation in the 1970s with high inflation, high unemployment. It includes moral imperatives like good people pay off their debts on time. All of that is woven together in an economic mythology. And I will say, mythology here, the way I use it, does not necessarily mean bad. You can't have an economic system without some kind of economic mythology upholding it. Because if we do end up moving into a techno-feudalist system, that will be upheld with a new and slightly different economic mythology. And the question is behavioral economics doing that? Is it moving our system in that direction? So where am I going? And I'll start by giving some examples from behavioral economics, and then I'll give my strongest possible case against behavioral economics. Then we'll connect that with economic mythology and how does it generally get distorted? And finally, what is my defense of behavioral economics? And as we do this, we'll talk more about the movement toward techno-feudalism and the way behavioral economics can either mitigate that risk or enhance it. So what are some of the classic examples in behavioral economics? And you notice if you read a lot of behavioral economics books that they repeat these same exact examples over and over. You get kind of tired of hearing the same example and you're reading a new book and you're like, oh no, they're about to launch into an explanation of this thing again. As such, I'm going to give 5 examples examples from the behavioral economics literature. And as I do this, be thinking about ways that these examples might create misperceptions that distort the way behavioral economics and nudging gets used in practice. The first, of course, is the cafeteria example. Put the healthy food early, the unhealthy food later. Classic example there. The second example here will be the hotel towel example, where if you can get people to reuse their towel for their entire hotel stay, that saves the hotel money because they don't have to do the laundry and pay somebody to deal with washing that many towels, and it saves the environment because the washing those loads has an environmental impact. So how do you do this? How do you nudge people to be okay with not having their towels washed every day? And one way you can do that is by having a little card on people's pillow when they come into the hotel room, where the card says 80% of people reuse their towel for the entire stay and don't need that washed. That's environmentally friendly. That's all it needs to say. And this is tapping into the herding effect. It's the fact that people have a rule of thumb that if most people are doing it, then it must be a good decision. And that rule of thumb sort of helps somebody from not having to stop and weigh the costs and benefits and think through, do I really need my hotel towel washed? Well, if 80% of people have made that decision, I'll just go along and save the mental effort of making that decision. So the card is a little way of nudging people toward the more environmentally friendly decision. Another classic example is the save more tomorrow example, where basically when you start with a new job, that's when you decide what percentage of your salary goes into the retirement account. And yet people don't want to save for retirement when they first start a job. Oftentimes they're a little behind on their finances. Maybe they've been out of work. They have hopes and dreams that they really want to invest in right now. So they'll say, oh, I'll start saving for retirement later. But of course, when later comes, they have the same hopes and dreams and they still need the money now. So on the first day of their job, when they're signing all their papers and making these decisions, you give them the option to save now or to save later, where you say, if you get a raise in this company, a certain percentage of that new raise will automatically go into retirement. You won't have to fill out the papers again. You won't have to remake that decision. They're making a decision for their future selves to start saving, and people will oftentimes be less myopic, less focused on the present when they're thinking about their future selves. Oh, my future self can scale back a bit, or maybe just not even notice that I'm not getting my full raise, that some of it's going to retirement. And that can be a really powerful tool for increasing the amount of money people end up saving for their retirement. In behavioral economics, this connects well with multiple self models, where you have an economics model where you have the current self, the present self, and the future self. And there's a little bit of conflict between their desires, but you know, of course, when you get to the future self, you may make a different decision. So there's some really interesting models around this that have to do with procrastination and compulsive behaviors. And this is just one example that we use to show here's how this could work out well. A fourth example here is the cigarette package image example, where people will put images on the cigarettes of people in the hospital or people with those tracheotomy things in their throat that look really uncomfortable because they have some lung disease or some cancer, and that's how the hospital deals with it. Sometimes these images will involve sort of showing the feet of a corpse. It's basically trying to get people to think more about the long-term consequences of choosing to smoke today. So it does also involve this multiple self model where right now you might want to smoke, but thinking about the future, if you were to account for your future self not wanting to die early, then maybe you can use these images that might shock people or scare people a little bit in the moment, but make them more likely to quit or less likely to start in the beginning. And this, of course, taps into the emotional self. Emotions have a strong pull with people. It taps into fear, it taps into anxiety, just a little bit of anxiety when you see the image on the package, and could that promote healthier behavior? And then another example here is the health insurance default option. And of course, once again, we're imagining the first day of work when you're making all these decisions about how your finances will flow. You have to make decisions about insurance. Are you going to get insurance or not? Are you going to get the higher quality insurance or not? And of course, people will oftentimes not want to make all these decisions. It's kind of overwhelming. So whatever is recommended by the company, the default option, if you don't click these other options, it'll automatically put you in the recommended one. Well, default options is a big focus of behavioral economics because it is one way of nudging people in the choice architecture. And oftentimes you kind of need a default option because a lot of times people just don't want to make a decision. They don't want to make a random decision. So if you have a recommendation from somebody in HR who's thought about it, people will tend to go with that. And the default effect is really powerful. If you switch the default from one option to another, huge amounts of people will sort of switch. It'll really, really change people's behavior. So yes, students in my class learn about these examples and learn about the psychological principles behind them. And then they take that information and build them into economic models that sort of connect the nudger or the person who's at a higher level of the choice architecture to the person they're nudging, the person they're trying to influence. And they have a semester-long research project that involves building that model and doing the game theory and writing about it. And things that they nudge people to do include voting and recycling and eating less meat, saving for retirement, taking up mosquito nets as a practice in countries where mosquito-borne illness is a thing, refraining from gambling, not wasting food in the cafeteria. And in this literature, the types of nudges that happen are nudges that people would want for themselves anyway. People want to save for retirement, people want to eat fewer Doritos, all of this stuff. But it can be a bit of a slippery thing in terms of nudging people towards something that the nudger thinks is good and pro-social, that the person being nudged might not agree with. And that gap between what the nudger perceives to be good and what the person being nudged perceives to be good, that can be bigger if there's bigger cultural differences between the groups. With that in mind, what is the case against behavioral economics? And I'm going to give 3 big classifications of arguments against it. My first critique here, I'm going to describe as who nudges the nudgers. And in most cases, the answer is their employers do. And 2 to 3 weeks of my behavioral economics course involve thinking about this tool set from a manager's perspective. Because a manager is essentially in charge of the choice architecture of employees underneath them. They're structuring the social incentives, the information environment, the explicit incentives. They're structuring the whole setup in order to serve the organization's mission. And that includes tapping into people's desire to do social good. And a lot of people will experience inside a corporation something they might describe as a corporate ick or a pro-social rah-rah around the corporation's mission. So one example here might be if a company had a product that was actually pretty bad for the environment, but there was one aspect of the product that was better for the environment than its competitor, say for example. Inside the information environment and the social structure of the corporation, the manager might really tout the green part of that product. Oh, when you are selling people on this product and getting them to adopt it, you are doing something good for the environment. That's a great way of inspiring people inside the company. And the problem, of course, is they may not be hearing the critiques that actually say, wait a second, on net, this product is really bad for the environment. So this distortion of information can lead well-intentioned actors to nudge in a way that is completely opposite of what they're trying to do. Similarly with propaganda, you could have an entire department of well-intentioned people who was designing the online environment to get people to go out and vote. They're promoting democracy, they're promoting accountability of the government, they're promoting really good values. The 12 people in that department may be entirely well-intentioned. But if all it takes is one person with access to the algorithms behind the scene to apply that getting people out to vote in a way that is favoring that person's favored candidate, where those algorithms are not applied to the other group, then it takes something that has a pro-social rah-rah thing about it, and without those people, those nudgers knowing about it, the nudging that happens at the population level could be more nefarious. If these examples seem really defeating to you, I'm actually going to return to them at the end of the video. I completely realize that both of these groups, both the group that's promoting the green, not green product, and the group that's promoting voting in that department, they are leaning into their best values. And recognizing that somebody's best values can be hijacked by nudgers to use against them, to use to bring the system into a techno-feudalist system, that seems so cynical. That seems so icky. And yet I do not at all want to leave you with that impression. As a matter of fact, I believe that cynicism is one of the main forces driving us toward the techno-feudalist system. So we will return to this dilemma near the end. Now, does this first critique say anything about whether behavioral economics is the economic mythology behind techno-feudalism? And here we're actually going to have to adjust the question a little bit. The economic mythology? There's never just one economic mythology. Different groups uphold different economic mythologies within themselves. Wall Street, corporations, government bureaucracies, the nightly news, all of these have their own variation on the economic mythology. And behavioral economics is not intended for the entire population. It's a mythology, a set of ideas and concepts and tools that is specifically designed for a particular group of people. This includes people who work in the explicit persuasive sector, which is advertising and propaganda. It includes managers, the management sector. And of course, it could become more troubling if people who work in academia and journalism, people who are supposed to be orienting their work toward the truth, if those people start to see a larger and larger share of their job as being about nudging, about organizing the information environment for the purposes of choice architecture and nudging, that could become an issue. A second category of critiques on behavioral economics I'm going to refer to as the drop in the bucket versus the ocean problem. So if you look at any one little example of nudging, it's really not a big deal. The costs that it's imposing on somebody is so small, it's so negligible. This is just a default option, a recommendation. This is just a little card on your pillow in the hotel. This is just a little image that you see on the packaging of your cigarettes. And if you evaluate any one of these from a zoomed in perspective where you're like, the benefit of reducing smoking a little bit versus the cost of seeing a kind of disturbing image for like a few microseconds when you're purchasing the cigarettes, the cost benefit there may vastly favor the nudging toward less smoking in favor of the little bit of micro anxiety that might be added to your brain as you see the image. So individually zoomed in, the cost benefit calculus goes one way in favor of the nudge in every case. And yet, if our lives are structured by thousands and thousands of nudgers, each tapping into perhaps a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of negative emotion, then that could amount to something that will lead to deep levels of anxiety, deep levels of fear, deep levels of distrust and anger and frustration that are not coming from any one little nudge, but are coming from sort of the mound of nudges we live within. And one problem here is that negative emotions outweigh positive emotions when it comes to motivating behavior. This is something called loss aversion in behavioral economics, where people are just more responsive to negative stimulus than to positive stimulus. That's something you can measure. Now, this second critique in behavioral economics can be helpful for us understanding how economic mythology can distort our perception of reality. We might return to our definition of economic mythology and recognize that there are concepts such as loss aversion. There are going to be models such as the multiple self model, and there are going to be examples such as the 5 that I started off with. And the whole suite of these come together to form impressions about what's valid and invalid economic activity in the system. And one way I explain this is by comparing an economic mythology to a constellation, where an individual idea or example is one star in the constellation, but the constellation comes together to form an entire picture that you could not see if you were just looking at one star. Each star in the behavioral economics mythology gives the impression that nudging is not a big deal. It's just one nudge. You actually have to zoom back to look at the entire constellation to realize the accumulation of nudges makes up our entire culture. It makes up the very water we swim in. The last critique of behavioral economics, at least that I'll talk about in this video, I'm going to describe this as the humans are irrational versus the environment is manipulative frame. So in this example, we're going to have the behavioral economist and the critic of behavioral economics who are looking at the same phenomenon, saying different things about it, making sense of it very differently. And what phenomenon might we be talking about? We might be talking about eating a whole bag of Doritos, failing to save for retirement, gambling away your college money, spending hours watching meaningless video clips that you know cause you anxiety. All of those behaviors could be described as humans being irrational, or could be described as the result of an environment that is intentionally manipulative. So to understand this particular critique of behavioral economics, you need to understand there are many, many different ways of defining and understanding rationality. And in my opinion, a mature economist is capable of using multiple different definitions of rationality, of applying them to a different situation differently, of listening to people to figure out what way is this particular person using rationality. There's not just one definition of rationality, and some of the definitions of rationality that are used commonly in economics are very counterintuitive to people who only use that word in the way it's used in the universal monoculture. This is a very deep topic, and I'm not going to fully go into it here, but there's rationality as a foil to bounce up against when you're thinking through ideas. There's irrationality as something to be engineered against. And as you might imagine, that is a behavioral economics perspective, where irrationality is something that is counter to rationality, that is against rationality. And then there's rationality as a methodological stance. And I'm not even going to define any particular definition of rationality, other than to say every single one of them is a construct. Every single one of these definitions is going to be a lens through which you're looking at the world. So some of the critics of behavioral economics will say, actually, whoever gets to define what is rational and what is irrational, that is an act of power on the part of the decision maker. So let me give you a quote from this book, which critiques behavioral economics. And in this quote, he's basically complaining that experimental economists who are behavioral economists, they come up with what they believe to be rational behavior. And anytime a subject of their experiment deviates from what they've already defined as rational, they will say that person is being irrational. And he's basically saying, wait a second, that's an act of power. You as the person who defines rationality get to decide we can engineer against people's behavior that I don't like. So here's the quote. The experiment is not designed to learn something about people that wasn't previously known. Rather, it is designed to grade people against some standard the experimenter has constructed. So as you can tell, he wants the kind of experiment that's trying to understand something about other people that might surprise you, that might actually come in and show you something about that person's values, that person's way of being, that the experimenter themselves could not have predicted and has not constructed. That's what he wants. And this goes along with the notion of rationality as a methodological stance, where the stance essentially is we're trying to figure out what drives this person. And there may be a gut wisdom in them based on their experience, their values, information that is available to that person that is not accessible to the economist. In other words, we're trying to learn from that person about why they do what they do, what could be driving what they do, and we're not assuming that we know better. This construct of rationality foregrounds gut wisdom. It foregrounds the fact that people have gut intuitions that are actually oftentimes wise according to their social environment, even if they can't necessarily explain what's going on with that gut intuition. Now, of course, you could ask the person, do you regret doing that? Do you regret the bag of Doritos? Do you regret gambling away your college money? And if they say they regret it, is this a case against gut wisdom? And by the way, when I teach behavioral economics, regret by the person that you're studying is a key indicator for irrationality. And at this point in this argument between our behavioral economist and our rationality as a methodological stance person, oftentimes the debate turns to the ancestral environment. The behavioral economist will say, people's gut wisdom is well attuned to the ancestral environment, where you have a group of people of 150 and they all know each other, and there's an intricate set of relationships that account for everybody's needs. Our gut intuition, our gut instinct is well attuned to that environment, but it's not well attuned to the modern environment. Is there a reasonable response to that counter-argument against gut wisdom? And of course, the counter-argument here is, wait a second, what you're calling irrational, and maybe you're calling irrational in the modern environment, I'm calling a result of a manipulative environment. And our critics of behavioral economics who say, no, it's not people being irrational, it's an environment that's manipulative, they look at the behavioral economists and they're saying, your solution to the manipulative environment is to pile on more manipulation on top of that. You're saying, oh, we're just doing a good kind of manipulating to counteract the bad type of manipulating. The critics of behavioral economics will oftentimes say, no, we need to remove the manipulation to give room and space for the gut wisdom that is inherent inside every human being. But there's another even more important response the critic of behavioral economics could bring up, and that is, are we taking these bottom layers of manipulation as a fixed and inevitable feature of the modern environment? Are we assuming that those are just going to be there no matter what, and we have to build on top of those rather than getting rid of those layers of our system? Because all of those layers of manipulation are crowding out gut wisdom and replacing them with the gut wisdom of the technocrats. As you can tell, I think a lot of these critiques of behavioral economics are not wrong. With all of that in mind, what's my defense of behavioral economics? Should I stop teaching it to you and to my students? Does this just make me complicit? So I would like to give 6 defenses of behavioral economics. My first defense is that a foundational war strategy is to know thyself and know thy enemy. As I mentioned, I believe there is a war over the economic mythology. So I'd like to give you a quote from Sun Tzu. This is from an ancient Chinese wisdom text about war. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. And I think you can tell behavioral economics helps us to better understand ourselves, and also definitely to better understand the strategies used by our enemy in this war over the economic mythology. My second defense here is that there's no such thing as not being complicit. Does me teaching behavioral economics empower the other side of this war? Yes, it does. Does it make me complicit? Yes, it does. But it also empowers our side of the war. And that's my third defense. My own thinking has been deeply shaped by how much time I spend thinking about and teaching behavioral economics. And I believe my work on this channel at least has some potential to serve our side of this war over the economic mythology, to bend the economic system towards something healthier than technofeudalism. My fourth defense is that there's no such thing as pure ideas that cannot also be used for nefarious purposes. If we throw out all ideas that can be used by the other side strategically for their goals, we're actually going to throw out the entire set of ideas in existence. Nothing is left. Every idea can be used in multiple ways. This is actually one of the most important things to understand to fight the creep towards technofeudalism. Because if you think about it, most people do not want a technofeudalist system. Only a small few want that. So how does a small number of people go up against a large number of people? And one of the ways of doing that is using a divide and conquer strategy. Polarization is incredibly strategic for those who want to bend our system toward their own interests. And one way that polarization can be upheld is by taking a concept that can be used in really evil and nefarious ways on one hand, but that also has really good and powerful uses to understand reality and to even understand our side of this battle. And if one group sees the evil version of that concept and another group sees the powerful and good and helpful version of that concept, then those two groups can go at war with each other, where these groups should be uniting uniting to work together to fight technofeudalism. For example, behavioral economics can be used for good or for evil. And if this causes groups who see the good and groups who see the evil in it to polarize over whether we should throw out the behavioral economics toolset or lean into it, then that's distracting us from addressing the real issues. My fifth defense of behavioral economics is that choice architecture is unavoidable. You have to have algorithms that rank something first, second, and third. You can't have a million results all appear in the first place spot. So somebody has to make these decisions about the choice environment. The person who determines the algorithm that sets that up is going to be designing a choice architecture, and there's no way around that. Default options are helpful, and a lot of times people want some kind of recommendation for decisions that require a lot of careful thought and time. My last defense of behavioral economics is that some of these risks can absolutely be mitigated. And I realize this is somewhat complicated because some of the risks would probably need to be mitigated from a higher level in the system. That not all of them can be mitigated from the individual level, but that's really what this channel is about. And as an example, if the nudgers, the people doing this nudging, had some kind of democratic accountability, that would go a long way. And when I say democratic accountability, this includes exit and voice, where voice is going to involve voting or participation in deliberative practices, rights to participate, such as free speech, all of that kind of thing. And exit means if you don't like the way this particular set of nudgers is operating, you have the ability to exit their little world they're creating and choose other nudgers instead. So for example, if there were programmers, hence nudgers, whose approach was causing you anxiety or mental illness, you would have the option to exit or choose a different algorithm. But other ways of mitigating these risks with behavioral economics can be implemented at a more individual level. And to think about this, I'd like to return to the cases where we have people nudging voting, where that could be used in a manipulative way by somebody who's adjusting the algorithm such that the nudging toward voting was targeted only at the nudger's favorite candidate. And the example of the green product, where the people selling the product were nudged into believing they were promoting a green product, whereas that was not actually what was going on. And I actually do believe quite a bit of that sort of thing is going on in our system, where it's almost like a modern day version of the banality of evil, where there's not even any evil in the individuals at all. There's just a lack of awareness of the whole system and the way the whole system acts upon them. Because most people do feel that other people are much more subject to nudging than they are. They feel that, oh, I'm not subject to nudging. So the people nudging the nudgers are sort of taking advantage of that fact. I really do believe this sort of thing is at play. And yet, even talking about this brings some risk. Thinking about this can bring in a cynicism that is absolutely self-defeating. The more cynical somebody is, the more gullible they are. I did a video explaining that, which I'll link to below. And I realize a reasonable reaction to what I'm saying on these topics is, wait a second, if I can't lean into my best values, what is there to lean into? And I absolutely would not say get rid of the leaning into these values, just like the person promoting the green product or the person promoting voting. Those people really are trying to do good in the world and should not stop that just because there's nudgers out there. But that's only part of the story. That needs to be combined with another part, which is the part that allows itself to be in touch with the truth. And here I'm talking especially about the part of the truth that our social circles and our industry milieu resists. I really do believe if we want to keep our values out of the reach of those who want to manipulate us, the key to that is going to be listening to our critics. And listening to them with an open mind, because so often when nudging goes wrong, it's because the choice environment has created this information moat that stops the information about the product not really being green, or stops the information about the asymmetry and application of the voting from reaching the ears of those doing the nudging. And the trick to overcoming that distortive information moat is going to be breaking down the barriers between polarized groups. So I really, really do not want this video to promote cynicism. If you want to hear my arguments why cynicism is associated with gullibility, why those two things go together, I will link to that video below.